I think it'd be interesting to talk about just to hear you and Hoichi, because we're kind of starting at the end here where he's saying, well, I have this thing, and what if, and it was done wrong, and what if I did it this way? But just to talk about the process, like you have nothing, and the business says, hey, we want to have this thing where, there's shapes and they're drawn on screen, and can you make a program that does that? And we know that we're going to want to add loads to it after it goes viral, so can you make it really great, and perfect? Like where would you start that process in order to try to adhere to this as well as possible, to be strategic about it? Does that sound like a good exercise?
The way I like to do it may not necessarily be the preferred method for everyone, but I can tell you my approach. I actually have a pretty bad memory. That's not one of my strengths. I've known a coworker in the past who has much, much better memory than me. And I know like the great chess players, for example, they have much, much better memory. And I have a feeling for people who have really good memory, they might approach it different. Like they might prefer more of a holistic upfront kind of approach. I don't do that approach. I prefer to build it like from the small and then grow it bit by bit. I actually try to stay with the concrete. I don't try to extract upfront. I try to write more tedious and more straightforward code just to get the feature working. And if that means code that looks more like their very first example, that's probably what I'll write, like with this switch statement. So I actually tend to approach it basically the same way that he does with every example. And then I morph it a little bit. Yeah, that's how I do it.
I really like that because I feel like we have so many conversations about good architecture. And to me, at least implicitly, like this conversation up to this point has been like, if you really should try to do this like all the time. But I tend to completely agree with you, Toby. Like, and I think a lot of us might feel like, well, you shouldn't really do it, but we do, is like write the switch statement. Like until you have 3 shapes, until you have 4 shapes, do you even need all of this like super elegant abstraction to make sure that your code is like super perfect? And
Mm-hmm.
is it even responsible to build it literally because of what we just talked about, that once you build it, then you're like kind of stuck with it? So if you only have 2 shapes, is it even responsible to try to abstract things?
Yep.
I definitely feel very similarly that, yeah, build it naively and then ease into patterns like this.
I think, like from my experience talking, like mentoring developers, the junior developers that are trying to level up, they will often jump to the abstract versions too quickly and run into the problems that we already mentioned, and then maybe their idea of what the interface is wasn't the optimal one. But although it's 2 degrees, obviously there's never the correct one and the wrong one, but maybe then later on we regret it and then we have to change it to a different protocol, and then that adds even more cost to the project.
There are 2 questions from this approach, which is like, first is at what point you're like, oh, I have to make abstractions instead of using switch statement. What is the tipping point? The second question is what if you have to decide the interface like right now? I mean, even before you write the actual implementation, for whatever reason, you have to have this interface because you have to work with another team, or you have to have separate 2 parts. What do you?
Okay. The first one is like, what's the tipping point? What's the sign you should look for, maybe?
Yeah.
Before you decide you should extract out an extension point or something like that. Do you guys have any thoughts?
For me, it's just until I'm doing something that feels really nasty, I don't feel a need. Like I let it just be motivated by that. You write that switch statement and there's 2 elements in it, and then by the time I'm adding the 3rd, 4th, 5th element, something starts to feel really wrong and it's becoming more tedious to do it. And so that's usually how I let myself be motivated.
It's the pain point. You
And,
let yourself be guided by the pain points that you experience.
and I trust my pain receptors.
Yeah.
Because that's hard to, that's going to obviously be different and subjective, but I think I got a decent sense of it. At least I feel like it served me well. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree.
To me is how if I see a pattern that I think it makes sense to abstract, because the more cases that you see, the easier to see the pattern, then the more existing requirement that you know, the easier that you see the pattern. And because you don't know how to extract until you see the pattern. So I will wait until I see, hey, it makes sense to extract this way because I have all these stuff already.
That's an important point too. I sometimes defer the extraction because of that too, which on the one hand seems irresponsible, but on the other hand, I think there's a reason for the madness. So there's a rule of three. This is for writing. No, rule of three, computer science. There we go. The rule of threes is a rule of thumb for refactoring. You should start extracting if there's 3 instances of the duplication before you start refactoring. But that's just a rule of thumb. Sometimes I defer it because I foresee things coming down in the pipeline that could change things, right? Like I'm implementing my UI and I'm implementing the layout engine. I'm implementing the rendering engine. And then I'm feeling some pain and I'm wanting to refactor, but I might have this worry that if I design my extension points now, I may not be considering what the needs are for later. Like I'm gonna need to implement keyboard focus later on. What's that going to look like? I don't know yet. I haven't thought about it. But what if the protocol I design now is very flawed and then sort of morphing my interface to be able to support the keyboard focus is going to require a big change. So that's what I don't want. And that's just an example. That may not even be true. Maybe like it's fine. The change is not going to be that bad, even if I did it now. But I don't know. The point is I don't know. And sometimes it does happen. It's like, oh, shoot, I didn't realize that feature that comes later is going to mess everything up. And now I have to redesign everything from scratch. And then all this work I've done is wasted. And so for that reason, sometimes I decided to defer the extraction until I added that other feature that I'm worried about. And then the code is still pretty straightforward, but repetitive. But at least I got everything working. And now I can look at the big picture as a whole and try to come up with a better extraction.
I have an observation, but I want to answer this for myself. To me, just like really simply, in general, when the trigger is like, what you need to do. Because I think maybe you guys agree with this. I think implicitly we all agree right now that it's better actually to write naive code that's not abstracted than to miss on abstracting, because it's actually more painful to have a bad abstraction than to have code that's written naively that we can then abstract once we realize what's going on. And so that sureness of I see how I can make this better is like, to me, a great trigger for, yes, it's time to do it. Because maybe you guys have experienced this too. Like early on in development, I remember so many times writing code and like writing an abstraction being like, this is great. I'm like never going to have to change this. And then never using it. And in fact, it causing problems because you want to do something completely different with the same stuff. And that abstraction is useless to you and it's dead weight and it's just mucking everything up.
Yes. Yeah, that can also happen. And again, that goes back to how good are you at predicting the future? But you're always too optimistic about your abilities. You kind of have to learn it by doing it the hard way. If you do it enough times, you'll get a sense of, yeah, this is a slam dunk. This is obvious that this is going to make everything better. And it's also obvious that it's going to be stable, because I've seen enough instances of these things coming in that I can feel pretty confident about that. For developers that are trying to develop this kind of skill, I would say, unfortunately, you have to do it the hard way. Start with a straightforward way and then morph it. I've seen a lot of developers really avoid that, because once you get something working, you're very reluctant to risk breaking that code. But unfortunately, that's what you have to do. I see developers, when I work with them, they tend to want to just jump to the end solution. Like if I knew that I was going to end up with the extracted version, why would I even write the plain, straightforward version? They just want to jump to the end, you know?
I agree with all your points. Yeah.
It's a trade-off, again, with many things in computer science. It's a trade-off, unfortunately. And I know people want a straightforward answer up front, but we don't have it.
I still think too, like everyone has that legendary developer, wielding a keyboard in their minds. And like, it's not really that developer doesn't refactor and that they abstract perfectly the first time. To me, it's more just like that they refactor at the right times and make the correct choice in the moment, which is not necessarily even doing anything special architectural. Like, to me, it keeps coming back to that as we talk about these concepts, but the build up to them is just as important, maybe even more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, developing skills for how to morph the code from the before into the after. That takes a lot of skill, because you are going to introduce bugs and you'll need to debug at some point. How do you make that transition more smooth?
You can do TDD.
TDD is one way. Yep.